Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys about the fact that there is no hypertrophy rep range, and you don't need to find what works for you. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. All right, first of all, as far as this whole concept of people always say, well, you got to find what works for you. No, you don't. If something doesn't work for you but seem to work for someone else, some really gifted person, it's probably because they are very genetically gifted and or they're using significant amounts of anabolic drugs, right? In terms of training, I'm not talking about fat loss, all this other stuff involving appetite and energy turnover. We're talking training, because your training is what puts your muscle mass on you, your size, everything else. The reason something works for them and doesn't work for you is because they are probably so genetically gifted and or using so many drugs that any stupid brain dead shit will work for them. They can do really stupid stuff that won't work for most people and still get fantastic results, right? It's not that you have to find what works for you, is that you probably need to find what works for everybody. And there are things that work for everybody, and then there are things that really don't work, and they just seem to work for a handful of people because anything works for them, or they're getting enough other stuff right that it doesn't matter. And when I say what works for everyone is training to your minimum effective volume with progressive overload. Because when we're talking about gains, we're talking about hypertrophy, we're talking about muscle size, that works for everyone. And I'm not saying there's not some individual anthropometry involved with certain exercises to where for you a squat might use a different ratio of quad to glute, or a low bar squat might involve a little more hamstring for you at a certain depth than someone else. We're not saying that's not the case, right? We're not saying some people don't have a slightly different ratio of muscle fiber recruitment between their interior delts and their pecs on a paused bench at the bottom, right? We know that there is different levers and insertions, everything, that they affect the ratios. But overall, if something works, it will work for virtually everyone other than maybe a tiny handful of people who are exercise non-responders or something like that. And I really can't cover that because I don't have the capacity to help those people. No coach in the world does, no expert does, no YouTuber does. And that's a totally different topic than no gainer. But as far as this stuff goes, yeah, if something isn't working for you but seems to work for someone else, you've got to remember that is because they're either a genetic freak or they're using a lot of drugs, and it just seems to work for them when in reality it really didn't. It was their genetics and drugs and the fact that they're training that worked for them. But the other stuff works for everyone. And if you are training to your minimum effective volume with any progressive overload, you will gain some muscle in all the affected muscles, right? And if you train with progressive overload with nearly maximum recoverable volume, you will probably make close to the maximum muscle gains you can within the context of your nutrition, your rest, your recovery, all of that. So when it comes to the hypertrophy, as far as rep ranges and training style go, those are the only factors that matter. The hypertrophy rep range was something I proposed decades ago that's turned out to not be true. A lot of studies, and I don't just mean one or two, there are dozens of studies that have looked into it at this point. Even guys like Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, Dr. Gaines has done tons of studies on this, and you know what we find? Maximum hypertrophy can be obtained with the 3 rep range, with the 8 to 12 rep range, by doing 20 rep sets, right? All of these things seem to be able to have the capacity to stimulate nearly maximum, if not maximum, hypertrophy. They're all the hypertrophy rep range. What seems to matter in that context is overall training volume and tension. Hypertrophy seems to be largely a response of training volume. Now, people need to remember training volume is not just your reps and sets. There's a weight component and a tonnage component to it as well, and you've got to remember that. In other words, if you come in and do 3 sets at 10 with 100 pounds, but you're physically capable of doing 3 sets at 10 with 200 pounds, if you do it with 200 pounds, that's double the volume, right? It's not just, oh, I did 3 sets of 10. That's not the entirety of your training volume. There is a work component to it. And there's even a range of motion component to it. If you find a way to trim half the range of motion out, you are doing half the volume. So we could even go so far as to say that there's even a distance moved component. And that doesn't benefit if you cut the rep in half and then double the reps either. No, that doesn't work either. Because again, you've lost tension. So it's not even just the weight on the bar, it's the amount of tension that weight placed on the muscle. And so when people try to change the context there, sometimes they'll mess that up and think, well, if I do these other things just to make the numbers look better, then it's going to produce more volume. No. Volume, again, is a product. The weight matters because the weight itself produces mechanical tension on the muscle. And if you find a way to reduce that mechanical tension, you also reduced the work done. But ultimately, that is what causes muscle growth. It's all about total training volume and the amount of tension that a muscle has been subjected to over time. That's what produces hypertrophy, and it doesn't ultimately seem to matter which rep range you use. Now, the old cliche when this information started coming out, and a lot of people used to promote it, hell, I used to promote it. I used to say, well, you know, it's probably a good idea to just do all the rep ranges if you want to get maximum size. And you know what? That's really a bullshit cop-out. That's a bullshit cop-out. I'm guilty of it in the past of saying that. A lot of current people out there say that's a cop-out. Because we all know that everything works. That's just throwing the kitchen sink at it. But you know what? No, that's not even necessary. That really isn't necessary. Because if we know based upon the data that you can stimulate maximum growth with 3 rep sets or 10 rep sets, no, it isn't absolutely necessary to do both. Right? It's not necessary to do both to stimulate maximum growth. You might have a preference to do so for programming reasons. Right? There might be good programming reasons to do so, whether it is periodizing or doing some concurrent training, or maybe you want to train really, really heavy, but you have certain smaller movements that you realize it's not ideal to do so, or it's an issue with training density. Right? It's a training density issue. Like in my case, if I don't want to do multiple sets of pull-ups, I probably need to just do really one high rep set of pull-ups at the end of my workout, even though I train almost exclusively in the 1 to 3 rep range. But then I come in right now and I just do body weight pull-ups to quite a bit higher reps at this point, right? And it's just a training density preference. I could probably throw some weight on there and do a couple triples. Just a preference. That's all it comes down to. And I think that's what people need to realize when you're talking about hypertrophy and rep range. You know what? I'm going to go so far as to say it is just your personal preference as far as what you want to do. From a performance end, if you have performance goals, it's no longer just personal preference, right? Because that's the other end of it. Different rep ranges have different performance components. In some cases, not always. But as far as their hypertrophy, they all have the same potential for hypertrophy. And yes, there are cases to where doing all the rep ranges might be beneficial for a programming or progressive overload just to ensure progression, maybe to help bypass the law of accommodation, but that's not necessary. You could get to your maximum size or stimulate maximum growth doing nothing but 10 rep sets if you wanted, or nothing but 3 rep sets if you wanted. You can even do concurrent periodization with a single rep range. Yeah, what? People say, well, how is that possible? It's totally possible. I've done it. I've written ways to do it. It's totally doable. That'll let you bypass what people are worried about with the law of accommodation right there. You can do concurrent training with the same rep range. There are plenty of programs out there that do it, don't they? So ultimately, I think that's a cop-out. No, you don't even have to do all the rep ranges. You can choose to do all the rep ranges. That's one method of going about it. But at the end of the day, as long as you are training above your minimum effective volume, and there is some progressive overload present, you will be gaining some muscle mass. Now, in an ideal world, you will be training close to your maximum recoverable volume, at least up into peaks and phases of time, with progressive overload present in an ideal nutrition and rest environment. And if you can do that, you will create maximum or even optimal hypertrophy, right? You'll do so in that context. But even having it at that ideal isn't necessary for hypertrophy. That's what you should probably do if your goal is to maximize your progress. Yeah, absolutely. But rep range itself doesn't really matter. It's all about training volume and tension, rest and recovery. So there is no such thing as a hypertrophy rep range. Doesn't exist. Data says otherwise. And no, you don't need to find what works for you. You probably need to find what works for almost everyone and do that. That would probably be a better idea. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.